Hi everyone, it's Jackie at Spare Room Studio, and today I'm back to colour in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland colouring book by illustrated by Charles Santore. And it is this very much grayscaled colouring book. And I started yesterday using Faber Castell Albrecht Durer pencils, which look like this if you're not familiar with them. And somebody knocked at the door and interrupted me. So that footage has been deleted because I'm not great at editing and patching things together yet. So all I did was started with one of the light yellows that I have here, and you didn't really miss very much. So we'll get going on it. I have an iPad here with the original version of Charles Santore's artwork, so that will give me some colour ideas. And as I mentioned, I'm going to use the Albrecht Durer pencils by Faber Castell. The colours that I've picked out so far are cadmium yellow lemon, light yellow glaze, and dark Naples ochre. And I have some water brushes here, various water brushes to use. And I wanted to try using the Albrecht Durers because I had tried on the first page in this book using water-based markers with water, and I used a lot of water. And it wasn't great because the colour went through to the other side. And because it's a picture book, storybook, I want to be able to read it with my granddaughter. I don't like the idea of too much bleeding going through to the other side. So I'm going to try the Albrecht Durers. Now so far there's some wrinkling and cockling, which doesn't bother me at all. It's just the colour bleed through that I was worried about more than anything. So I thought that I'll give this a go. I might just readjust the camera here a little bit, bring you down a little bit more, and hopefully you can see what I'm doing. So let's get started. Pardon me, the frog is still with me. So to start with, I was just using, trying out the two light yellows, the light yellow glaze and the cadmium yellow lemon, because the original colour scheme that Charles Santore used was quite an unusual light that he's captured with his watercolours. And so I thought that I would have a go at trying to create something similar. If I don't quite pull it off, I'm not really upset, but I'm just using it as a guide. And so that is the cadmium yellow lemon in particular that I'm using here now. So what I'm, pardon me, what I'm hoping is that by just lifting the colour off with the water brush from the tip of the pencil, and hopefully not saturating the paper too much, I might be able to mimic that sort of watercolour look without the bleed through on the other page too much. So that's the loose aim that I'm starting out with. Now, as always, I'm prepared to change my methods if I need to as I go along. If I find that something's not going to work, then I'm not too caught up in sticking with these. If I do have to bring in pencil later, I'm going to do so. But we'll just get started with this watercolour look base and see how far we get along with it. Now you may have watched the first one that I did in this book, but if you didn't, there is a lot of grayscale. So we've got all the clues of where shadows and highlights and lights and so on should go, because this is actually based on the original artwork produced by Charles Santore. So he's done all the work for us really. He's a brilliant, or he was a brilliant artist. I think he passed away a few years ago now. But he was an absolutely brilliant artist. So he's given us all the information we need to go on here. And of course, as with anything, you're always free to go in your own direction in a colouring book. If you decide that you'd like to try to achieve a different look, then you feel free to do that. You don't have to be locked into recreating Charles's images, but they are provided to you at the front and the back of the book for inspiration if you'd like to have a go, or just get some colour ideas for what you'd like. So the most highly lit areas, I'm using the yellow. I'm just loosely going off of what I can see on my iPad. But it's very highly lit in this section here and her sleeve, and there's quite a bit of reflection and light into her face there and the ribbon and so on. There's also a little bit of a glow from the light on her legs, and I'm going to start suggesting that. Now in the original picture there are actually some lights on this wall here that are not here in this version. But I still think that's nice to put that bit of yellow there anyway. Okay, so that'll do me for starters. Then I'm going to use the dark Naples ochre to start darkening up some of these shadowy areas. Now, something to note if you haven't worked with grayscale before, particularly with these lighter watercolours and coloured pencils and lighter sort of mediums, the grayscale does influence your finished colour. So if you've swatched this onto white paper and then use it onto grayscale, it's not necessarily going to look the same. So keep that in mind when you're choosing your colours from swatches done on white paper, that when you apply them to this grayscale, they are not going to look the same. The grayscale influences the colour that you're laying down on top of it. Now this is quite light in a lot of areas, so it's not a big deal, but definitely in these darker areas it's going to change the look of your Albrecht Durers quite a bit, or if you're using watercolour. And even the pencil to a certain extent it did. But something like an alcohol marker tends to cover up just about anything unless you're using a very, very light colour. So when you use a marker, alcohol marker in grayscale books, it's very handy for giving you shadows and definition without having to do too much work. And it will work like that to a certain extent here with the watercolour too, but you just need to be aware of the fact that your colours are going to look a little bit differently than you may be expecting or you've experienced in the past with your pencils. So I've had quite a challenging weekend in some ways, and more so, from the little Pico dressing pump that I have on my back wound. It has been buzzing constantly and driving me mad, so it made sleep very difficult last night. So that's annoying. You may hear it. I did notice on one video that you can hear some slight little buzzing. It sounds a bit like a mobile phone getting a text message when it's on silent and it's vibrating. So if you hear any of that noise, it is this little pump that is attached to the dressing on my back, and I can't do anything about that at all, unfortunately, because believe me, if I could, I would be, especially when it comes to sleeping time. So sometimes it does it, some dressing changes it hasn't done it at all, but after Friday's change, it's not been the greatest all weekend, so that's been very annoying. And then sadly yesterday we got the news that a friend of the family had passed away, and he had been unwell for quite some time, and yeah, it's still sad. You know, it's sad for the people that he leaves behind, and how it affects them, and of course you know you feel for them. So a bit of a mixed weekend. My son has started moving his things out to his new unit that he's going to be living in, and so there was a little bit of, you know, not upheaval, but a bit of stuff going on. So this morning, you know, I'm very tired after not a lot of sleep last night. So you know, my go-to when I'm feeling a little bit out of sorts or a little bit tired and just don't know what to do with myself is colouring. It's something that does help relax me. It helps quieten down my mind. It just slows things down for a little bit, you know. And particularly working in this method, I find it just that little bit more relaxing. So now I'm going to start choosing some warmish browns to go into her hair and for her skin on her arm. So I'm going to use some burnt sienna here. I've still got a little bit of that ochre on the tip of my brush, so to start with it might you know, blend together. And then when I've put down a little bit too much colour like that is, I just come back after cleaning the brush off on the paper towel, and with that damp brush I just lift some of that excess colour off, because my initial aim is to try and mimic a watercolour look. If I can't achieve that, I can always darken areas up with pencil later and come back, but to start with, my initial aim is to try and keep it light, airy, and very much in the vein of watercolour painting. So I try not to put too much saturated colour down to start with. So I'm not sure, can you see my paper towel there? No. So what I do, I'm just dabbing, you know, that little bit of excess colour back off there and picking it up with the wet brush and just gently doing it. It's just a little process of back and forward until you get the depth of colour that you want. You feel comfortable with how it looks. And I'm deviating a little bit here from Charles's painting because this area of her hair looks rather dull and flat on the painting, but I want to just warm that up a little bit with that burnt sienna. Is it burnt sienna? Yeah. So I'm just going to extend that up there a little bit, and I'm also just going to put a little bit there in the shadow of the ribbon. And you may or may not be able to tell, I'm really lifting up the tiniest bit of colour off of the tip of the pencil there, and it's still quite concentrated when I put it onto the paper. So if you're in the market for a watercolour pencil, these are pretty much top of the range with some Caran d'Ache and brands like that. The Albrecht Durers are the top of the range for Faber Castell. They are quite an expensive investment. However, if you're serious about watercolour, and you can see that I'm using the tiniest bits of colour here and I'm getting a nice effect, these pencils will go a very long way. They will last you a long time working in this manner. If you like to colour directly onto the paper and then activate the pencils that way, you will obviously use your pencils to a much greater degree. And working that way means that you have to sharpen your pencil a lot more, which means that there's more risk of breakage and losing some of your pencil that way. But if you choose to work this way, you're taking the tiniest little bit at a time, and they will last you a very, very long time. Now, I've had this particular set for, I've gone over there and it's actually her ribbon there, but never mind. I've had this particular set for well over 20 years. I won it as part of a prize when I was studying art at a secondary campus, and at the end of the year we had an exhibition and my work was chosen to go into the exhibition. And at the exhibition opening they announced some prizes, and I had won this set of Faber Castell Albrecht Durers, and I have not used these consistently. There have been very long periods of time where I have not used these pencils, so that's why when I say I've had them 20 years, I've not had them in constant use in that time. I go through periods where I don't touch them at all for a very long time, and I used them a lot when I used to create original artworks, but in colouring books I don't use them quite so much, although I have decided now that I'm enjoying them so much that I am going to get them out more often and use them. But if you are looking to invest some money into some quality art supplies, I would suggest that you look at these. They can be bought open stock in art stores. By open stock, if you're not familiar with art stores, that basically means that you can buy one pencil at a time. They usually have the full range on show, and you can just purchase whatever single pencil that you wish at a time, and it does cost you more doing it that way. But if you don't want the whole set and you just want to choose a few colours, then that's a perfect way to get started. It's also a perfect way to test out whether you like a product before you commit to spending a lot of money on the product. So you can do that with other things. You can do that with pencils, you can do it with markers, you can buy individual paints and so on and so on. So keep that in mind if you're on a budget, that you can purchase your pencils that way and try them out before you commit a lot of money to them. So this is, the light one is sky blue and the dark one is ultramarine. I'm going to get started on the ribbon. Now this is not going to be the same colour as Charles. Actually, I might change up that. I won't use the sky blue. I will use light phthalo blue to start, because I think that might be more similar to what Charles has used in his painting. But there's some very, very light blue in these highly lit areas here. So I'll start with that first. And I'm sorry if you're a regular viewer and you watch me over and over, you will notice that I've been repeating a lot of the same information over and over. But I'm just doing that because, there might be a new viewer who hasn't seen what I do before. And there may be viewers who have not worked with their pencils in this way before. And so I just like to talk through what I'm doing as I do it, because it just, it just helps to cement it in your mind while you're watching. And if you are in fact colouring along with me and trying it at the same time, it just helps cement some of those ideas into your head. So I'm just using the light phthalo blue, and the ultramarine is now what I'm using in these darker areas. And I've closed Hamish out today because he needs a bit of practice at being on his own again. And he keeps popping his head up at the window and looking at me. He can obviously hear me through the window even though it's closed. So out the corner of my eye I keep seeing this little face popping up at the window, which is quite comical. If you can't afford the Albrecht Durers, there are lots of other budget range watercolour pencils, and some of them are actually quite good. I think it's Kory over at Colourfully Optimistic has done a lot of reviews on watercolour pencils. I'll try and remember to link Kory's channel in the description. But there are some surprisingly good budget options when it comes to watercolour pencils. And the only difference that you will find if you can only afford a budget range and then you're looking at these is that the pigment will be a lot less vibrant, and that means you'll have to work harder at getting the same level of vibrant colour as what I'm achieving here with very little effort. So that is what the difference is sometimes when you're purchasing expensive art supplies over cheaper ones. Obviously for a colouring book it does not matter at all what you're using. You don't really need it to be light fast as such. So when that's not a concern and you might be thinking, well, I'm just going to use cheap products in a book, which is what I often make that choice myself. But what it can often mean is that sometimes they are more difficult to work with, and you have to work a lot harder to get the same result as what somebody using an expensive product like an Albrecht Durer or a Caran d'Ache or something. And the results will not be quite so vibrant, or you might be able to achieve that result but you'll have to work a lot harder to get it. So keep that in mind. Sometimes I'm more than happy to have my budget brands like Crayola and the student grade Faber Castells and so on, because I find that having to work like that, to work harder, sometimes makes me be a little bit more experimental, and I get more creative at how to overcome some of the shortcomings, whereas when you work with these sorts of things, you really just sit and relax and the product does a lot of work for you. So it really depends on your budget and your reasons for colouring. You might not have the time to be messing around trying to get the best out of a product and have a bit of a tussle with it. So that might be, the last thing that you want to be doing, and that's perfectly understandable. I do have more time on my hands. I have a lot of time for colouring. And just, sometimes I like to have that little bit of a challenge where I have to think outside the box about how I'm going to achieve the same look with a Crayola pencil or a super tip marker or something like that. So there's a few things to consider, when you come into colouring, and I'm just going to lay some colour down now over her legs here for the tights, and I'm going to put the phthalo blue in, and I've used quite a bit more water there, so hopefully it won't bleed through. And I'm lightly going over the yellow, but not with too much blue because I don't want it to go too green. So I don't mind if the paper bends and cockles or buckles. That I'm okay with that, but I'm trying to avoid too much bleed through of colour, because I want the story to be, the text on the back to be easy to read. And I want it to look like a storybook when we finished, or I finished, so that I can sit and read this with my granddaughter. And 99% of the time, I don't worry about the bleed through too much. If it's a regular colouring book and it ruins a picture on the other side, a lot of the time you can make adjustments and cover it up and work with it. Or a lot of the time I think I've got so many books and so many pictures to colour that I'm okay with sacrificing some of them. But in this particular instance, it's the type of book that I shouldn't say you, I want to have a slightly nicer result at the end of it, because I want to be able to share it with my granddaughter, and we both get some enjoyment at looking at the pictures and reading the text. So I think this will probably be my last image of Alice for the month of September. It's the 30th of September while I'm colouring this. I've been doing so many Alice pages because of the hashtag being held on Instagram by Sabi and Colourful Louisa. And I wanted to participate in that hashtag to get as many Alice pictures coloured as I could. So that's why my finished pages this month are going to be very heavily influenced by Alice in Wonderland images. And I won't stop just because the end of September is here, and the hashtag's no longer relevant, but it will slow down a little bit on the Alice subject, because I'd like to start doing some spooky Halloween type images for Halloween coming up, and basically just get into some of my neglected books. And I've also got a few new books that I recently showed in a haul that are non-Alice related, and I'd like to start colouring in those. Particularly the Tomislav Tomic book I'm looking forward to getting stuck into. So okay, so that's a good start on there. And again, I'm not having to make a lot of effort. The grayscale's doing a lot of the work for me. I'm just going to darken some of these shadows up over here. If you're not familiar with working with watercolours, the general consensus with watercolour is that you need to start with your lightest colour first, and you need to gradually deepen your colours, because once you go dark, it is very difficult to lighten off a dark colour in a watercolour without adding white or some other product to it. It's difficult to lighten an area back off. So the thinking is that you just start lightly and build it up. You give yourself the opportunity to keep assessing how much darker you need to go, and you know, if you want a highlight, you try to preserve the white of the paper, and that's your intense highlight. You know, so for example here, there's very little colour on here. It's going to be one of the highlights. In here is going to be, again, a bit lighter, and here so on. So I'm going to try not to cover that up. Now, her white pinafore has got so much grayscale, that's going to be really difficult without the addition of some sort of pencil or other product to lighten that back up. But it might read enough as a light colour to not need to do that, you know, as a white, sorry. So I'm just having a look. I thought that might be part of her ribbon, but it's not. It's actually a small corner area in the room there, like this one over here. So luckily I didn't put too much blue on that yet. The walls in Charles's painting are very much a lilac-y blue colour. I'm not sure if I'm going to do it that colour yet, but yeah, that's what he's used. And there's a little touch of blue on that sleeve there. And the fan is blue too, but it's a slightly different blue, so I'm going to use light ultramarine for that. Very lightly, and then I will come back and put some more colour on the bits in between each rib of the fan. Now, if you don't have a steady hand, you could do something like this in the pencil very lightly and then activate it. If you don't trust your brush skills. And I don't mind if a bit of blue spills over onto the fan, because it looks to me like it may actually be light grey or considered white in the original painting, and then he's used a bit of grey to add some shading, or a bit of blue. But I think it's supposed to read as a white fan. And then the colour is in the bottom part of it here. So thank you to the people who've been watching the recent video where I talk about the other Alice in Wonderland book that I purchased that I believe to be AI generated. And I talked a little bit about my feelings about that. So thank you if you've watched that and been sharing your thoughts and comments with me. And I thank everyone for being very respectful of each other's feelings on the subject. That's really appreciated. I'd like these tights to be a little bit brighter, so I'm actually going to introduce some light cobalt turquoise just to liven up that colour a little bit. Just in the areas where it might be a little bit lighter, but not the highlight areas. And that's one of my favourite colours. You can see that I have used that one a lot. They're a little bit banged up where I've used different sharpness and things with them in the past, but they're, you know, the pencils themselves are perfectly good. Now I'm going to look at a little bit warmer colour in her face as well. I think that I might use brown ochre and just put a little bit more colour into her shadowy areas in her face. I've gone a little bit too dark there. Again, the grayscale is quite dark, so that is a little bit off-putting on her face. I find grayscales great in other areas and very useful, but it is a little bit off-putting on skin. It tends to make the colours of the skin look a little bit, for want of a better word, dead. You know, like not a nice natural colour. And I've got a feeling that I'm not going to be happy with this grayscale showing through the watercolour in all the sections, so I will probably be adding some coloured pencil, I think. You know, I like it in some areas but not in others. So I do have my Faber Castell Polychromos here with me, and I think I might get those out now, because I don't think I'm going to finish this for you in this one particular video, but I'd like to get Alice completed at least, and that is quite wet, so I'm going to have to be careful using the pencils over the wet areas. So, pardon me. This is India red in the Polychromos. And I'm just using a small sharpener there. It's a Statler sharpener that has a bigger and a smaller opening, because I don't want to chew my pencils up too quickly. And a couple of my really good mechanical sharpeners, they damage the barrel of the pencils, and I'd like to keep my Polychromos looking nice for a little bit longer. So I'm just going to start darkening up some of these areas in here, because this area is dry. And I'm just going to start trying to get a little bit more definition into this face. So the Polychromos work really nice on this particular paper. So if you have this book and you have Polychromos, I can recommend that the Polychromos do seem to work nicely on this paper. They work well over the grayscale. So I'm just doing a bit of a flicking motion there because it's hair. I don't want to describe every single hair, but I also don't want such a bold, saturated colour that it looks like she's got a helmet on her head. So these areas that have got the darker grey scale, They look quite dull and flat at the moment, so I'm just trying to make them seem like they're a little bit more lively and a bit warmer here with this Indian red. So today's video, while I'm sharing some tips about how I would colour this page, I'm not sure that it's going to get completed today, or how in fact I'm going to complete it. But it gives you some ideas of how to get started. And if you haven't worked with your watercolour pencils in that way before, just a few ideas of how you can use your watercolour pencils, and it works very similar with the Derwent Inktense pencils as well. Okay, so now I need something a little bit darker than that, again, just to do a bit more definition. So I'm going to use walnut brown, just to come into those really deepest, darkest shadows. She doesn't have brown hair, but I'm using brown as that deepest, darkest, shadowy area. And that's actually a cast shadow on her face from the ribbon. And I'm going to use this for her eyebrows here. And I'm going to go over the line of her top eyelid where her eyelashes would be, and I'm not going to draw in eyelashes. I'm just using a bit of colour there to suggest the line of her eyelashes. And I'm just going to use it here in the lip where she's got a bit of a darker area of her lip. I will come back and put some lip colour on there with another colour. Okay, that just helps to define some of those darker areas a little bit better. And let's just go back to that Indian red. And I'm going to just use that to deepen this area up to make sure that her arm doesn't look like it's completely flat, that it is in fact almost like a cylinder. And I'm just going to put a little bit of that under where her frill is there. And a tiny bit into her hand here. That paper is still a little bit damp, so you've got to be careful. Your paper should be completely dry. It's not quite wet there. Your paper should be completely dry before you come in with a coloured pencil, because you're just going to tear up the surface of the paper if you use a sharp pencil. So while we're waiting for some areas to dry, I'm going to put some colour onto her shoes, and I want to do indigo and now this is another name that always trips me up, Indanthrene blue. Indanthrene. Number is 247. So I've got the dark indigo, and that is 157. So the dark indigo is just going to go in the shadowy deeper areas. I want them to look like she's got very dark shoes on, almost black, but I don't want to use black. So it's going to have the hint of blue about it. So again, I'm just referring back to the original one of Charles Santore, just to get me some ideas of where the light sources are. If you're not confident with things like that, feel free to use sources. You know, look at pictures that are very similar and use sources to learn about these things. If you were creating original art, you're always urged to look at real life and draw from life. But sometimes we don't have those reference things to hand in our life. So Google images and have a look and work out, you know, where things should be if you want your shadows, highlights and so on to be believable. You know, look at pictures and study them and see how light falls on different surfaces, whether it's a shiny surface, you know, a soft surface or a hard surface. Just get those ideas and you'll find that it will just start to make things like shadows and highlights that little bit more believable, and it just elevates your colouring results quite a bit. You don't need to sort of have, you know, hugely realistic skills, but it just makes things that little bit more believable. You know, like you're getting it in the right place. It helps to describe things and tell that story so much better than when you get them in the wrong places. I've now got cobalt blue greenish, and I'm going to use that on some of the hair ribbon here. Just to help describe some of this. So Charles has helped you by putting the grayscale in, so you find the correct placement for the shadows and the highlights. But if you don't quite understand how the colours would look, then you can also Google the images and look at the coloured images for that purpose, where you learn to put the colours for their maximum benefit as well, and understand how the colours work in shadows and highlighted areas. I remember once when I had art classes and we were drawing, and there was quite heated debate about whether we should be using photographs and cameras and so on to get reference material from, you know, for our drawings, because the old masters never had those things. They had to draw from life, and, you know, that's how it was done. And I remember somebody saying, you know, do we not think that had they had the opportunity for those things, they would have used them? Because they did develop ways and means and tools to be able to draw and portray perspective correctly. And you know, the camera was eventually invented and used in many ways. So I think especially when you're just colouring for a hobby, use any sort of tools or reference or methods that are going to give you the result that you want and the enjoyment that you want. And don't feel like you have to know all that for yourself. I mean, eventually you'll start picking up the knowledge and you won't need to look to others for the advice. But you don't have to be the, font of all knowledge. You can look to others for picking up ideas and giving you some tips and anything that makes it a little bit easier. By all means, don't feel guilty about using those things. Things like blending fluids and blending pencils and so on were created for that very reason, to make life a little bit easier for you. If you want to sit and layer and layer and layer and layer your pencils, then that's great. You're quite welcome to do that. But if you don't enjoy it and you find it tedious, try a blender pencil or a blender medium or a blender marker. Thankfully, we have lots of opportunity for having a go with some of these things now than years ago. Okay, this is quite, on the picture it looks quite greenish in the shadow area. So I'm going to add a little bit of May green and just see what that ends up doing to the grayscale. I wouldn't have thought to do that normally, but looking at the picture, that's how it reads to me, so that's interesting. So I'm just having a look through my screen to see how that's looking. I've mentioned that before as well, that sometimes it's very handy to step back from your work to see where things are obvious to you, that when you're up close and focusing on the details that you actually don't notice those. I'm going to warm her face up here a bit. I want to bring in a little bit of, I think maybe more of an orange. So this is cadmium orange. And I've got a little bit of dark something on there. There we go, that's a bit better. So I'm just going to warm that up with a little bit of orange. And then I want something on her lips. I'm thinking, what am I thinking? Venetian red. Just a little touch of colour there on her bottom lip and also here on her top lip. And some of that Venetian red can come up there in the shadow as well. Now I don't like the way the grayscale is making that look, and because I have now brought in pencil and it's not purely a watercolour image, I'm going to add a bit of white into here, and we'll see whether it can just lighten up. It's not really achieving very much. Yeah, I'm not a fan of that grayscale on skin at all. And the white isn't really achieving very much. Something you can do before you do your watercolour is you can do a bit of white pencil to preserve the white areas like that. Like, I don't want this to get any darker. So by putting that layer of pencil down on the white, then when I come back with my, let's have a look, what am I going to use? So when I come back with my dark Naples ochre in the Albrecht Durer, it should avoid some of those areas, hopefully. The pencil sort of resists it a little bit. So I think perhaps what my feeling on this is, if in future, if I decide to use a water-based medium like this on the grayscale, I need to be picking bolder colours than yellow, because the yellow with the grayscale just isn't really, you know, creating a nice effect for me. Other people might like it, but I'm feeling like, no, it's leaving me a little bit, feeling a bit flat. So to warm it up a little bit, maybe I'll just use just grab my Albrecht Durers again. I've got both my Polychromos and my Albrecht Durers are in wooden cases, so if you can hear a lot of noise, it's the cases that they're in. So this is light ochre. It looks a little bit warmer. Let's try some of that over the grayscale areas and see what happens. I'm pretty much coming up to the hour mark, so I will call it quits in a moment. I think my washing machine should be finished by now, and there'll be some laundry to hang out on the line. Go and check what Mr. Hamish is up to out there on his own. So in case that's not showing up on the camera very well, that's drops of water there from her tears. I'm just using this all on the areas where he's suggested grayscale. And of course we don't have to completely cover the grayscale either. If you want to, you can make a feature of that grayscale showing through and make that part of the effect of the storybook. There we go, that's brightening it up a little bit. Right, so I think I might leave that there today, guys. If when I come back to finish this, I may record another version of you, but that sort of gives you a fair idea of how I use my Albrecht Durer watercolour pencils, and it will give us a fair idea too of how that's going to look on the other side here. So it's quite wet still. There's a little bit of shadowing, but I think that's because it's wet. When that dries, that's not going to be really obvious. So that is one way I could potentially get some water media into this book without too much bleed through. So I'm going to pick that up for you to have a look. Take my backing sheet out. Just trying to get that to focus in there. So you can see what I mean about that grayscale showing through. I'm not sure, I'm not quite sure how I want to leave that. To me that looks like quite an illustrative style that you quite often see in children's books. You know, so it might be acceptable to actually leave all of that. I quite like that little touch of yellow there, just lightening up the legs. And that is actually showing a bit darker on screen than it actually is in real life. When I move it further away, that is more... This is more like the colours look in real life here now. So there you go. So thank you for being with me today. Let me know what you think of this one. Are you going to have a go with your Albrecht Durers and your watercolour pencils this way? Or have you tried it? And tell me what you think, if you liked using it, or what drawbacks you feel like it might have for you. Just let me know in the comments, and I'd be interested to hear how you find it yourself. Okay, so that's it for today, and I will see you again really soon. Bye now.